Cool. Welcome back to another episode of Both Sides Now. We're with Shane Jones this week. Kia ora, Shane. Great to be with you.
Kia ora. Greetings, folks.
Hey, so we're going to start the podcast with the same question we start every one with, which is what political ideology or philosophy do you identify with?
Well, I'm somewhat quixotic. I grew up in the far north, classic rural upbringing, admixture of the Dalmatian gum digger and Māori and Pākehā, and we grew up on a farm. So majority of the influences surrounding my upbringing were those that you would generally find in rural New Zealand. But through my Māori side, and we learnt the language, and a lot of my people adhered to Labour. But being a farmer, my dad and them, they were of the tradition of the old-time Sir James Carroll, Sir Aparanangata national tradition. And I've ended up in New Zealand First. So I've got an approach to the economy which is quite conservative in terms of maintaining the value of money, but in respect of matters pertaining to education, internationalism, I have quite a liberal outlook.
So is New Zealand First left or right wing?
The guts of the membership of New Zealand First really occupy and straddle the two. On some matters, very conservative. On other matters, surprisingly liberal. So it's a classic case. I mean, it sounds a tad trite, but a lot of the members of New Zealand First, they believe that politics should be put through the fulcrum of common sense. If it works, let's try it, as opposed to being so committed to a particular ideological shard that it's impossible to move away from.
So obviously you began your career in the Labour Party. How did you sort of end up there? Because many would argue that you were more right than left.
Yeah, Don Brash really put me off. I had the privilege when I was in my late 20s of working for the David Lange government for a short period of time. Incredibly impressed by the politicians of that era. Obviously, Mr. Lange, who probably, if I had to identify a political hero, it would probably be Lange in my youthfulness. But obviously, I've got an enormous amount of respect as well for Helen Clark and obviously Winston Peters. The durability of the latter beggars belief. But look, I had the privilege of going away and winning the Harkness Fellowship and studying at Harvard. And I was always taken by the reforming zeal and the very strong approach that Richard Prebble and Geoffrey Palmer and others took, including Roger Douglas, took to reforming the economy. But by the time I joined the Labour Party, that phase of its existence was over. But I was a great admirer of Helen Clark's leadership, and she provided the opportunity, and the thought of following Don Brash into battle didn't fill me with joy at all.
So what changed for you to think that New Zealand First better represented your views than Labour?
Well, the modern day Labour Party is part of a broader progressiveness movement in the Western world. And too much of Labour, for my liking, had become beset with partly identity politics, but the culture wars. Now, it's ordinarily a term that one would associate with the United States, the culture wars, and part of it is fictitious anyway. But I just ended up, I think, being too far right of Labour. Probably I wouldn't have been right of Labour in the certainly in the 70s and 80s, but by the time the 2000s had arrived, there were other issues that were riveting and taking the attention of Labour, and they just weren't the issues I prepared to waste time on.
So obviously you joined New Zealand First after leaving Labour. Did you ever consider joining National?
Well, when you join a political party, it's as much about networks and it's as much about as it is about philosophy. I mean, if anyone ever thought that you joined a party purely for philosophy than study John Key. You join it because of often the social network you belong to, the priorities, partly through your upbringing, and whether or not it represents a vehicle that will give meaning and effect to values and beliefs that you want to stand for. So I never saw that with the National Party. I was probably had an opportunity to join National earlier on in my life, but once again, I worked well with Helen Clark. But after the momentum of progressive politics and everything that it entailed, I just wasn't prepared to spend time and energy on it, and other people were, so get on with it.
What about progressive politics do you struggle with or not necessarily agree with?
In New Zealand, I think far too much energy and time is exhausted, for example, to do with microaggressions as to, are you a man, are you a woman, are you something in between? I personally just find that not a moral issue, but I don't like the way that it feeds a sense of victimhood. And secondly, it represents an issue to me that should not be centre of politics. And for much of Labour in my time, those types of issues were centre of politics.
And obviously a big kind of change in New Zealand that you would argue could potentially be part of the progressive movement at the moment is the debate around co-governance. Where do you sit on that?
Well, obviously I'm a Māori, and I think that at the moment, the Labour Māori caucus have well and truly overreached on the question of co-governance. I think that most New Zealanders are proud that New Zealand has the Māori language. We're not naturally a bilingual or multilingual people. We're just stuck down here in the Pacific, predominantly Pākehā, and speak a type of English that other countries may not understand. But I had the blessing of knowing both languages and raised my kids to learn both languages, and they're reasonably comfortable and fluent in them. So I'm very proud of that part of our heritage, but I'm very, very anxious about the overreach. I don't think that it makes sense to endow every part of the public estate with a special Māori name. Often they're unpronounceable, they don't make any sense. And it sounds a bit heretical for me as a senior Māori to say that, but I grew up with the language, so I can say what I like. And but look, co-governance, I think, has ended up getting a bad name because with stealth, it's been introduced into the three waters imbroglio. Had it not have been forced through that already very contentious policy, it's not to deny that there's a problem with the quality of our physical environment insofar as water, but that solution I seriously doubt will ever see the light of day. On the question of co-governance in areas such as the health department, look, I personally wouldn't have pursued that strategy. I would have created a higher level of incentives to have the system respond to all sorts of challenges and problems. But anyway, the current government have nailed their colours to that ideological mast, and who knows, there might be more Kiwis who are cool about it than appear to be the case in the media.
Is co-governance 50-50 Māori and European, or is it as a percentage of population?
Well, you ask a very good question. Where co-governance, to the extent that I'm familiar with it, it has been introduced as an option to arrange management of features of the dock estate. And often the dock estate is of such importance to the overarching community that it should remain a key public asset. And I'm cool with that. But where it's located, perhaps in a Māori rich area, it makes sense to get the local people involved in pest control and access and things like that. But I'll tell you what, that is a far cry from deciding to reorganise the largest item of public expenditure after welfare, which is called health, on the basis of co-governance, or have co-governance as a key principle of reforming the water system. I just think it's overreach, and I think it's going to lead to a great deal of pain for Labour at the next election.
One of New Zealand's first, your policy positions that more well known for is on pensions. Can you explain your thinking around for or against a different pension age for Māori and European?
Yes, so that issue was originally popularised by Sir Graham Latimer in my time, who was a very famous Māori leader from Kaitaia. And he had a simple approach. As a leader of the Māori Council, he said that the eligibility for Māori for the pension, given they don't live long enough, should be less than 65. That then got quite complicated because then you had to define what was a Māori. And the whole Māori identity question is evolving as our population evolves. You could be like Shane Jones and his whānau, Dalmatian, Pākehā Māori, but we identify with our Māori side because we grew up next to the marae, went to church all the time. The language is a regular feature of our life. But then I've got second, third, first cousins that just get on with life. And they're part Welsh, they're part Maori, they don't really care what they are. And they're living the good life on the Gold Coast or somewhere over there. So, I mean, these identity questions, it's a little bit like you asking me before about progressive issues. I mean, it depends on the family and individual, and some people feel very strongly about them. Now, I personally am relaxed about leaving the age for all New Zealanders. I think immigrants should know. I think there's a problem with we've let too many migrants get the pension too easy. But that's a different issue. On the question of should Māori and Pākehā or anyone else get the pension at the same time, yes, are there specific issues for our Pacifica and our Māori community who perhaps aren't up to working in blue-collar work by the time they're 62, 63? Yes, but I would say to you there's another welfare response to that as opposed to tutuing around with the eligibility age.
Should the pension age be increasing as our life expectancy increases?
You know, I think it'll be your guys' generation and the Chloe Swarbricks of the world. I think that will deal with that issue. My generation, we're cool just to leave it where it is. I suspect, though, in the future, when there's a new generation of politicians, perhaps born in the 90s, they will want to change it. But it won't be changing for as long as I remain in politics.
Māori are often overrepresented in all the wrong statistics. It's kind of a well-known thing in New Zealand. Why do you think that is?
If you want to intervene in a person's life and have a dramatic impact on their wealth-generating capacity, you've got to intervene when they're very young. The problems are not congenital, they're environmental. If you want to really drive better outcomes for a family, ensure that the kids, when they're very, very young, have high quality access to education and the creation of an environment that reinforces the value of education. I think it's too late by the time you get to university. University students, the way has largely been paved for them, and they've got interest-free loans. So I don't plan to spend too much time teeth gnashing over the fortunes of university students. They'll work it out. For society, the problems, in my view, lie when the kids are a lot younger. The other thing too is that the types of jobs and work and also the culture of a lot of Māori is they're still drawn to blue-collar work. And you can make a lot of money out of blue-collar work. I don't mean to disparage it. The importance, I think, though, is whatever choice they make, got to make sure that them and all sectors of our community, they have the skills, they have the aptitude, and they have the opportunity to improve their skills. After all, some of the most wealthy people in New Zealand, they're not necessarily professionals. You need look no further than Graham Hart for that story.
Speaking of young people, do you think New Zealand First has missed a beat with outreach to young voters? It's well known that the voter base is typically the older generation.
Yeah, the analysis that we've shown is that about 12 or 15 years ago, where in the 60s was the average the average age of our voters. It's dropped now right down to 50. And we lost a lot of... New Zealand First had about 7.5% of the vote in 2017 and then got Mike Tyson smashed in 2020. But most of that vote that left us, it went to Labour. And the vote that sustained us was actually a younger vote. Now, admittedly, not of the generation or who are at university or just leaving university, but people around about 50 years old. And I put that down to the impact or the focus that the party has taken on industry, manufacturing, and essentially endeavouring to scoop up people associated with the sort of blue-collar sector in New Zealand. And we shouldn't underestimate as well the number of Māori voters that turn out for Winston Peters. But they're not really people to the extent that I can recognise them in our party conferences. They're proud of their whakapapa, but they're just getting on with life. And they want to see the median Māori wage grow from $51,000 much higher. So they don't really have a great deal of patience or interest in the Renaissance identity issues. Not that they have animus towards them, it's just not a priority for them.
One of the biggest political, I think, we'll look back historically and see one of the biggest political decisions of the 21st century was New Zealand's first decision to go with Labour. There was a lot at the time put on the fact that, a huge amount of the future of the nation was riding on Winston Peters. Was part of it with you as well, and did you have much of a say in Winston's decision to go with Labour?
Well, at the end of the day, take nothing away from our leader, Winston Peters. He provided an opportunity for the caucus to reflect their preferences. He reported back to the caucus the nature of the negotiations, the makeup of the coalition agreement, potential one way or the other. And when he announced his decision, it was the decision that reflected a thorough debate and a very exhaustive process, even with the people that comprised our board of governors, for want of a better expression. I think you've said something very apposite there. It was and will prove to be an extraordinary decision given what it has set in place. And I'm not being churlish about Jacinda Ardern or the current ministers, but what we're witnessing and the ability of the government to have coped with the COVID and whatnot would not have happened had our party gone in a different direction. But look, the sense that we had at that time was there was a mood for change. Number two, the purpose of running coalition negotiations is to secure the best outcome for what your party represents and what your perspectives are as to where New Zealand should go to. And we placed a great deal of accent in terms of dealing with provincial deficits, which is why we had the Provincial Growth Fund. We're a party that would like to see the role of the military expand in New Zealand, and that proved to be possible in respect of dealing with Grant Robertson and Jacinda. But your point is well made. It was an extraordinary decision.
Do you think, looking back, you were able to achieve what you wanted to achieve working with Labour?
Well, on the question of the Provincial Growth Fund and the military refurbishment, yes. However, it gets back to a matter of political culture. The political culture attracting and driving the Labour Party caucus members and Labour Party voters is different than what motivates me, in the sense that if you look at Australia, there's a whole momentum around the green teal, the blue teal movement, which is slightly different from the green movement and very different from the liberal movement. And I think when you're looking at types of different foci and priorities in New Zealand, have a look at Aussie as well. So some things we were able to achieve, but hey, we're a minority party and we were bound by the coalition agreement. And our main focus was to demonstrate to Kiwis that we could create a situation and sustain a government right through to the point of the election. Now, it's arguable we should have distinguished ourselves more prominently, perhaps could have campaigned in a different way. but you can do your head in running that race again. That race is over. We've got to think about the next race.
A big part of your career has been built on trying to gather support for Northland. Do you think Northland's poor infrastructure and poverty, is that more attributed to poor policy-making decisions in the past, or is it just you've been unlucky on the wrong side of sort of this global trend of, brain drain from rural to urban areas?
Yeah. Well, Northland, as much as we might believe that it's an exceptional place, there's no great exceptionalism about Northland. The dramas of confronting Northland can be found in parts of Hawke's Bay, Tairāwhiti, around Gisborne, the Deep South. We treat our R's differently, and then parts of Whanganui. So, although Northland's the home of the treaty and Spirits Bay and land of the missionaries and the muskets, and if you look at our colonial history, at the end of the day, it's been a safe national seat. And when you're a party and you've got a safe seat, you tend to take it for granted. It's just human nature. So there's been a fair measure of that. And also, for much of the North, we've been maintained on a diet of low expectations. We represent about 3% of New Zealand's population. And I found there was always a sense that, bugger all's going to change and we'll do the best we can. So when I arrived and started splashing dough through the PGF with Calvin Davis and Grant Robertson and others with their support, I think it took Northlanders not partly by surprise, but they couldn't believe it was happening. And then COVID came along and it was as if it never happened. But that's just politics. New Zealand, I don't think is facing quite the brain drain problem that it was in respect of people hollowing out the provinces and all going to Sydney, Australia, Auckland and Wellington. There's a fair measure of people who are content to live and bring their children up in provincial New Zealand now. But we have to continually invest in the features that give people a meaningful life in those areas.
Do you think that Provincial Growth Fund money in Northland did make a meaningful difference?
I think on the ground it has. It made bugger all difference to my political fortunes, which for the first 6 months after I got my rear end booted out of Parliament and caused me to seethe. However, that's come and gone.
We spoke to Materia Turia a few weeks ago.
Sure.
She mentioned that she opposed the TPPA publicly while she was in Canada. You criticised her for that, saying she should have held a New Zealand position while she was overseas.
Well, I think in fairness to Materia, she's a member of the Green Movement, and that's a global movement. So presumably the Green MPs are a part of a global mission. And I guess that's how she justified what she did. The point that I adhere to is if you are a parliamentarian and you are overseas and you are publicly advocating a position, in my view, you should park up at the domestic doorstep, matters of that nature. I personally don't believe she or Christopher Luxon should ever, if you're a parliamentarian, be overseas mouthing off about the misfortunes or fortunes of your own country, because you are a politician wherever you go. And go to Canada and have a holiday, sleep in a teepee, do whatever you want, but don't embroil yourself in distorting or misrepresenting what's happening back home.
It's interesting, you seem to talk quite a lot about what seems to come through this idea of the sort of like the standing that it takes to be a politician, the way politics should sort of be conducted. Do you think we've lost an element of sort of the prestige around politics and being an MP and what politicians achieve?
Well, a lot of us were attracted to political life because of an element of romance and sort of grandeur and generally having access to the levers. that effect change in your society. And they're definitely there, without a doubt. If you, however, you misuse those levers, or if you're very clumsy with them and you misread the room, which I think Jacinda is in danger of doing, then you'll be washed out. The types of people coming into politics today, we don't really, it's become a profession in itself. And I think that part of what we miss in Parliament at the moment is abroad, less the ethnic, less the gender diversity, but it's more the social background that people are coming from. And I can't think of very many politicians at all who are either in possession of 2 university degrees, or at least 1. And that in itself reflects the walk that you've taken in your life. Gone are the days where you come out of the smoko room, or we have the odd character like Bob the Builder, self-made man, Mr. McKelvey, an incredibly affluent and highly respected New Zealander. But most of the younger ones that I see coming through, they are, in my view, political professionals. They're already pretty good at politics before they arrive. I mean, Michael Wood is a good example. For the left, the training ground is often the union movement or the university common room. Sometimes school teaching. And for the right, I think you just need to look at the current leader to see where the right's drawing its members from. Caucus members.
Yeah.
So what's your advice to a young person wanting to go into politics? What would you say to them?
Don't do as I did, do as I say. Look, I was 45 when I came into politics, arguably a bit too old. But I had the privilege of various other positions that have taken on my life. And my wife of that time passed away now. We had a big family. So I wanted to spend time with those kids before really committed to politics. But look, gain some life experience. And I think it's a really good idea to understand the different segments of the community, immerse yourselves in them, and bring a ballast of genuine life experience with you. Because if your approach is technocratic or purely a process approach, then be a bureaucrat. Don't be a politician. Because when you're a politician, your job is to defang the bureaucracy, not to ape the bureaucracy.
Do you think we've got too many people employed in the bureaucracy at the moment?
Far too many. I would take the Aussie approach. Every time there's an election, the top 5 or 6 CEOs, they hand in their resignation letters. And then a government chooses its own 4 or 5 top CEOs. Yeah. In my experience, the public service at the moment is far too large, not adroit enough, and I think it'd be a very good idea if each government coming in could retain or change the top of the tree.
Changing lanes slightly, something that I think a lot of the rural community in New Zealand is quite disheartened by is the planting of farmland and pines specifically for carbon. I think we're all for New Zealand forestry industry, but where land's being, good farmland's been planted specifically for carbon credits. What are your thoughts on that?
Man, did I get bashed up by the farmers as the forest minister. If you look at the challenges that we've got with climate change, and I'll put to the side whether or not we should be doing as much as we're trying to do about climate change if America, India, and China aren't going to do anything. So I'll put all that to the side. If you want to effect a change to the emissions profile, then you're left with limited options. Well, what do you do? How do you stop emissions? You can severely tax things, and you can maybe close down industries. But that in itself is hypocritical because you just end up importing carbon. So then our party settled upon expanding the size of the nation's lung, if I can put it to you that way, expanding plantation forestry. And where the matter has enraged the rural farming lobbyists is that land that is capable of generating food, in some cases, is being transferred over into carbon forestry, either 50-year rotation, permanent, or 25-year plantation forestry. But I say to ourselves, well, if we're not going to have larger sequestration capacity, how are we going to deal with the transition of climate change? I think the solution lies in enabling ongoing afforestation, but only in those parts of our landscape that to maintain a farming business there is marginal. Because farming itself is going to have a come to Jesus moment in respect of nutrient regulations, more water regulations, and a welter of new environmental regulations, many of which I'm very, very doubtful about. So I think there's a happy medium, and I do accept that a lot of the settlements are very upset with the billion tree strategy. But, farmers, they jealously guard their property rights, so they're the ones selling their land. But that sounds a bit churlish. I would strike a better balance than perhaps I was able to do. In the end, the areas where we planted the majority of the 9,000 trees that we were able to get in the ground, hectares of land for trees, was Māori land. I sort of gave up on the general cockies in their land because it got incandescent. But with Māori land, it's a different kettle of fish because it's all tied up with the Māori land court. It's owned by every man and his third and fourth cousin, half of whom aren't even in New Zealand anymore. So planting the land actually enables it to be used for some greater productive purpose.
Could part of that balance be expanding our lungs with natives, even though they are more expensive?
I think it's a very legitimate course of action to plant more native trees. It's less the problem of the cost. It's more the problem of how long they take to grow to match the sequestration capacity of a pine forest. So you kind of have to have a view, maybe 100 years, 150 years. But obviously, the way in which our economy is structured, it's you get a better bang for your buck from a pine tree between 0 and 50 years. But I do think that there's an incredibly important place for recloaking a lot of our landscape with pine trees. There are trade-offs. Like if you want to improve the ability of your economy to function with less harmful emissions, then you've got to do something about energy. I'm all for disrupting the energy sector in New Zealand. And if I had my way, I would have used more of the Provincial Growth Fund money to have effected changes to our transmission capacity in energy, so that investors can come and pop up wind farms and pop up solar farms in parts of provincial New Zealand where they can't at the moment, because the size of the pipe, the ability to transmit the energy from the site of production to an end use just doesn't exist. And that only maintains the stranglehold that the current stakeholders have over our energy sector. And that's ripe for disruption.
Mm. You mentioned wind and solar. New Zealand went through Think Big, where we put in all these new dams. We've looked at this energy neutral dam now in Central. What about just more dams on our waterways? Is that something, it sort of seems like it's sort of taboo now, that because we'd have to flood a couple of farms and...
Unless you drive those changes through Parliament, I'm just not confident that under the current statutory framework you'd get more small dams. But these are the trade-offs that climate change demands of us. And at the moment, I don't think we're in the right sort of, the temper of the time, rhetorically, is climate change sensitivity. But when you look at the decisions that investment is making, and it needs a statutory consent, no one wants a dam. I'm a great believer in more irrigation capacity, water storage, the expansion of energy generation in New Zealand. And the important thing to do is to de-risk it by ensuring that investors who put more carbon friendly energy generation capacity on the ground that they can transmit the energy at a very affordable rate and break the stranglehold, which is afflicting a great deal of hardship on too many households and businesses. We are an energy expensive economy.
I want to go back to a comment you made before about farmers having quite a lot of work to do. What do you make of the groundswell movement?
I think recently they shot themselves in the foot. They ended up calling for people to make submissions, more recently about Three Waters. And many of the submitters said, we support the groundswell submission, but groundswell submitters themselves didn't actually make a submission. So it's an amateurish error. But I think the high tide mark of the groundswell approach has come and gone. I think more of the farming leaders themselves are wanting to be a part of the solution. And the groundswell movement, whilst it stirred up a great deal of angst and it attracted a lot of attention, at the end of the day, that has to translate into policy. It has to translate into durable political action. One thing that I didn't like about them was the very vile language that a lot of them had about Jacinda Ardern. Like, I'm a dad, I've got 4 daughters. And at the end, politics, you can also make it. Okay, how would I like that if I was on the receiving end? And they didn't do themselves any justice by having those loose units there. And hey, in the day of gotcha social media, you only need a small number of those mouth farts, and then the whole thing starts to look as if it lacks credibility, eh? The lesson for any movement, whether it's Brian Tamaki, whether it's Groundswell, whether it's the Greens, New Zealand First, the activists currently in the Green Party trying to shaft James, whoever, your actions have to translate into institutional change. And in New Zealand, unless you're going to take it in some sort of revolutionary Russian way, that means mediating change through the institutions of governance. That's how our system works. And I think a lot of them have yet to learn that lesson.
I think that's a very important point. I think it's very easy. I think it applies across all walks of life. Very easy to complain. It's harder to actually come up with a solution and try and actually make meaningful change.
Yeah, occasionally a crisis will emerge, and that provides a pretext for making change. You could say that Rogernomics was a response to a crisis, but then even today, there'll be no shortage of commentators who point to Australia, that they responded through their structural adjustment program far more effectively than Rogernomics. And I mean, we borrowed a type of Thatcherism, really. And anyway, that's going backwards. Look forward.
So what's the plan for the next election?
Well, fortunately, we've got the gorilla off our back, which was the unwanted depredations of the SFO office on our party. So that's come and gone. And when you're a small party, which we are, you have to amass enough putia, resources, to run a campaign. But it's important to identify a small number of issues that resonate with the public. And those issues have to not only plumb the public consciousness that, yes, this is an issue that's making me feel very strongly one way or the other, but what are you going to do about it? So then you need to have practical solutions that you can sell. And you've got to be able to deliver. I mean, one of the problems at the moment with Jacinda and her government, and you can partly blame COVID, but once you get closer to election, people start to look, okay, but what did you actually do? Because the average Kiwi, unlike Shane Jones, they have a terribly narrow window of concentration for political events. Like, I might go now down to the pub to the Swashbucklers and I'll be talking politics. Down there, they'll be talking about the weather has to improve so I can go fishing. That's the extent of their interest. But look, now I'm looking forward to playing a role in the next election. And as I said, the challenge is to pluck some issues out, have some solutions, and create a means of communication that it resonates with enough Kiwis, 180,000 preferably, to get over the 5% threshold.
When people think about New Zealand First, they think about Winston and yourself. Is there some legacy thinking going on in New Zealand First around how you want the party to look in sort of 10 years' time?
Yeah, no, that's a damn good question. I mean, the first thing we need to do is re-establish New Zealand First as a part of the political landscape, the parliamentary landscape, and then attract and maintain the interest of younger people to want to commit to a political career in a minority party, because your chances of enjoying power and substantial influence are generally larger if you're in a bigger party. But then rare opportunities arise, and Winston Peters managed to utilise that rare opportunity in 2017. None of us knew that COVID was around the corner, and I certainly had no conception that a pandemic would have the effect of driving well over 50% of the voters to one party. And I don't mind saying that. We campaigned partially on our record, and going forward, but the phone was off the hook.
You talk about you need to engage some young people in New Zealand First. Why should a young person vote for New Zealand First or even join the party?
I think if you hail from the provinces and you're concerned about the provincial deficit, and if you are concerned about matters related to a party that's backing the economy, a party that's backing legacy industries, manufacturing, and a party that keeps a weather eye on levels of immigration, so that the foundation influences that define New Zealand aren't swamped by unfettered levels of immigration. There's only one party who's going to do that. It's New Zealand First.
And to finish, what's one policy change you would make right now in New Zealand?
I would definitely be on disrupting the energy sector. It's a somewhat boring topic to talk about, but irrespective of your age, irrespective of your status in household wealth or industry, the cost of energy is essential to the cost of living. And the cost of energy and the type of energy is essential to the journey of climate change. And it tends to get overlooked because it's an obtuse and it's area sort of dominated by all these Pharisees who speak a language that general Kiwis can't follow or understand. Well, I'm in the business of breaking that up.
Awesome.
Kia ora, Shane. Thank you very much.